Am I the only one who thinks MMORPGs miss the point of their genre? This isn't to say that some aren't extremely successful, such as World of Warcraft, Lineage 2, and others, some of which are now very venerable games including EverQuest, Ultima Online, Dark Age of Camelot, and Anarchy Online. And that certainly isn't to imply that they don't provide quality content, because otherwise no one would play them. But can we really say that we play on anything other than large, semi-free roaming theme parks at best? Or that Oblivion, Skyrim and the Far Cry series aren't better MMORPGs than pretty much all MMORPGs to date? What I'm driving at is that despite the pretense, marketing and titles, pretty much all MMORPGs are not living, breathing worlds. And in most, especially now that the free-to-play model is so successful, content and world building are seemingly the least important thing when a company decides to make an MMO. You may be wondering what the fuck I'm on about, but the thing is, effectively, many free-to-play games, and many of those that were once subscription model MMORPGs, are mechanically the same game, with a different skin, and while the world itself may look different, it's not as though the worlds are constructed differently. While the forests, rivers, and valleys may be different, the monster placement, interactions, quest systems, and the importance of the major factions are similar across all games, with a player fulfilling the same role in each: a sidekick. A character in a story which is not theirs, but they play a part in it significant enough to interact on a somewhat meaningful level, but relegated to not having a say in what the impact is of their own actions. Insignificant enough to not be required for anything other than lending a hand in a set-piece battle, and that when the next expansion is released, they can be used in the manner of an errand boy for them to build up their reputation all over again. I'm not just having a dig at the reputation systems, but actually how the quests are laid out, and how the NPCs interact with you, the player, who should be by at this point a figure on par with Beowulf. But you aren't, and it isn't, and in most cases NPCs at the tail end of the storyline seem only to be vaguely aware of who the player character is. I think that most MMORPGs find themselves building in an awkward direction. They feel that the player's primary goal is to have a power fantasy played out for them. This would be great if each player had their own unique experience, but the nature of the quest systems, overarching storylines and boss battles mean that in reality, the meaningfulness of the interactions are relegated to achievement hunting and have no real consequence on how the player feels about their avatar on a character level. The character is a tool with which the player can kill enemies, rather than a person with a story, trials and victories all of their own. So you killed the Lich King once. So what? I killed him 9 times. And worse yet, the big boss that terrified players 2 expansions ago is now weaker than a forest animal in a new release. How the hell do you reconcile as a developer putting in a bear in a new expansion which is more powerful than a dragon that was created last year? It's entirely disjointed, because the nature of the system is built to provide players the illusion of a power fantasy, when in reality they are on a treadmill that only goes faster, but tells them that they are burning less calories than ever before. The problem isn't even the genre. The problem is that a certain mechanic system has been used without major changes for over 20 years, and if you really want to go back and pick that apart and look at the source, you can extend that back to the 1970s. But Dungeons & Dragons doesn't have this same problem, probably due to its scale of only having to support a dozen or so players, and has an active dungeon master who controls the world. The crux of it, the class level based system, a focus on combat over community, and the strange idea that if you copy an original enough, you can get something better than the source item. The level system effectively segregates high and low level players, meaning that a new player in an established game often feel entirely isolated because the majority of areas they pass through while leveling are devoid of any other players, because the areas are nothing more than a highway in which a character progresses, ever onwards to the promised land, the end game, and when they finally do get to a point when they're at a similar level to other players and start to meet new people, they often find they might as well be starting over from level 1 again because they're well behind the curve of what the average player has acquired. And so, the world itself is crafted, not with history or storyline in mind, but a highway for a single player, with off-ramps to monster camps which can quickly be accessed, monsters defeated, items looted, and returned to the area's hub to hand in the quests, sell the loot, and buy food and water before setting off again, back down the highway to the next area. Does it really matter what this area is meant to represent? Do players have to understand the story half the time? World of Warcraft has this issue in abundance. After the most recent expansion has been out for more than a few months, the population begins to slowly dwindle, and even returning players from the previous expansion will find themselves in an unwinnable game of catch-up with the remaining population who have already devoured the content at launch. unless they rejoin exactly when the next expansion hits, and are at the highest level for the prior expansion, so they are in step with everyone else. Because as soon as that expansion hits, the items hoarded in the previous expansion are now nearly meaningless. Even with the standard talent system, players quickly boil it down to one or two specific routes to take. This is doubly true if you're a healer or tank, and work in groups. Players who deviate from the standard builds are often ridiculed and shunned for not adhering to Creed, and often this is quite understandable, as deviations from the most efficient builds will simply not keep up. A warrior is a warrior is a warrior, everything else is down to aesthetics or time invested. This is regrettably a self-perpetuating cycle. Players search for the most efficient builds. The devs need to keep up with the desires of the players for more powerful gear, and to provide a challenge at the same time, so they raise the bar. This excludes anything but the most efficient builds and aids in segregating the community. The class system enforces conformity in the player, and the level system serves to segregate. And more often than not, after racing to the end at breakneck speeds, they arrive at a new central area for high-level players to convene, with all their needs catered for, creating haves and have-nots, those who have ground their way to the highest level and those who haven't. The solitary, nomadic nature means that there is no place for somebody to focus on anything other than combat. You quest and you kill your way to the highest level. Every other system is a bolt-on that surrounds the idea that the player is a combatant first, and anything else a distraction from the monotony of killing monsters. The focus on combat, the focus on experience points and levels, means that there is no time to form bonds, no reason to communicate, and so you end up with the usual cesspit in most games, general chat, where most of the time, unless heavily policed, it is a den of abuse and trolling. When it finally comes for a player to take part in endgame content, the content is set up so they must now have to deal with other players, which means that someone who has spoken to few people in the game before they hit max level must now come out of their box, deal with other people, and to quickly learn an entire new set of systems in order to partake in the real game that all the prior work was done for the sake of incrementing numbers. All this means that you have a world in which people inhabit but there is no community, where a city may have a few dozen players in but none of them have a reason to communicate, because it doesn't increase the value of what they're doing. In honesty, the level system in most MMORPGs is really superfluous. While the reasoning, I've heard at least, that it's there for players to learn how to play their class, they firstly do not need to spend 100 hours or more to understand a spell rotation, and then after they have completed the expansion's content and the new expansions arrive, they have to level up again. If they already know how to play their class, what the fuck is the point in leveling up again? And leveling up anything solo really doesn't provide the required experience in order to properly contribute to a group doing a highly technical set of tasks. MMORPGs need to reconsider the foundation upon which they are built, because ultimately what the game is, with all the facade removed, is a game for completing boss runs ad infinitum. There's no way you can have a meaningful crafting system in a game laid out for a class level system to be the foundation. It is simply too dangerous for a person who is not a combatant to ever leave the cities, and since the loot system coupled to the class level system prevents meaningful crafting anyway, there's no point being a crafter to start with. And in some games, for some obscure reason, the maximum achievable level a crafter can reach is intrinsically tied to the combative level of the player character. And while you may think I am just picking on Warcraft since this pertains a lot to it, there is a reason for this. First off, World of Warcraft took the best parts of EverQuest and other early MMOs, including the battleground and crafting system from Dark Age of Camelot, and made improvements to both systems. And secondly, Warcraft has been photocopied by many other games without seeming to understand what made Warcraft work, and why a half-rate copy isn't going to compete. In short, many of the points I'm raising here can entirely relate to other games of its ilk, and while some have gone to great lengths to counter some of the issues, in most cases they don't seem to have an independent thought in their collective dev team, and can't seem to work out a way of making a system work in a more community-minded fashion. You need only look at some of the subscription-based games which quickly, or not so quickly in some cases, ditched their subscription model and went free-to-play when their population tanked hard. If you need a reminder, here's a few. Age of Conan, Star Trek Online, Lord of the Rings Online, Dungeons & Dragons Online, Star Wars The Old Republic, Elder Scrolls Online, WildStar, Anarchy Online, kinda, and EverQuest 2. And some of those were very, very high-profile flops. Most of them, except EverQuest 2 and Anarchy Online, which predate Warcraft, and I haven't spent much time in WildStar yet, most on this list were heavily based on the same systems that Warcraft use. Some of those were supposed to be so-called WoW killers, but apparently it doesn't matter if you're George Lucas. When you're aiming to compete with a 10 million subscriber based game on its own terms, you're not gonna win, and why should it? Why should anyone ditch a game in which they have invested thousands of hours and acquired vast amounts of in-game wealth and items to start all over again in a game which is effectively the same, but with a different coat of paint? So really, when we're talking about introducing a new MMO, we shouldn't concern ourselves if it's going to kill another game, but what it can provide players which is different from the current offering. Most games have kept the same formula, but have added a sprinkling of decoration around the edge to make it seem different. Star Trek Online had the Star Trek IP and a space combat system. Star Wars The Old Republic had the Star Wars IP and was a story-centric model and a crew of interesting characters to play with. But at the core was the same system as Warcraft, its predecessors, and I will word this in the nicest way I can, the games which took heavy inspiration from Warcraft. And this is still the most popular model. It seems that it's the only model that's adopted by aspiring MMORPGs which have enough financial backing in order to advertise and galvanize the community and generate enough hype. When games deviate from that model, they're often working on a much smaller scale. It's often that they are either an older game which didn't establish itself during a time when Warcraft was a thing and have achieved success on its own merits, such as EVE Online and to a certain extent Ultima Online, or that the game was released more recently and have achieved incredibly limited success and are often of a quality level graphically, if not also mechanically, which is far below what is to be expected in this current day and age, such as Darkfall Online and Mortal Online. The MMORPG and its spectators need to understand that Warcraft is its own beast and it comes with a set of established IP which is originated in the gaming industry and not in film or TV. So you don't have to try and convince someone to pick up an entirely new medium to engage with an IP which they are already in love with. You aren't going to be able to compete in the same sphere. Because why play your game which is like Warcraft when you can play Warcraft with an active population? New MMORPGs must strike out on their own, choose a new model, and actively work to not be put in the same box as Warcraft and its brood. If MMORPGs are to achieve that of a living, breathing world that has a community based around the game for the game's sake and not mere accomplishments, then a new model is needed, one that doesn't segregate the community based on mere relative character power, which in turn will allow the developers to create a world that actually feels like a world, and not a small set of city-states surrounded by an empty theme park with highways running through it. The market is saturated with half-baked, partially abandoned or understaffed games, as some have horrific instances of free-to-play, and the genre seems to have routinely missed opportunities to create a game which is truly groundbreaking. And we are now in a rut, which we have been in for the last 5 years at the very least, where few new games are being released which vary in any way to the established models. I yearn for the day when a game will come along and actually be a world I'm drawn into and feel a part of. And this is not an impossibility, as other games that aren't multiplayer do this well enough already. I feel that despite all this, I should shout out a few games which don't use the established formula, which can be worth a look. Some are old and a little ugly, some have systems upon systems from being active for many years, and all of them have their own issues. But give them a shot if you haven't already. Ultima Online, but don't bother with the official servers, find yourself a good free shard. Anarchy Online, it does use a class level system, but in a different way. All your characters have individual skills which you have to invest points in. The one character is not the same as another. It can be a little depopulated in some areas, so find yourself an organization, which is AO's version of a clan. EVE Online, but read a lot first on what you're getting into. Spreadsheet Simulator can be an accurate description, and there is a big issue, in my opinion, with war declarations stifling new corporations and can lead to a long time of no fun. And that's really all I have to say on MMORPGs at the moment. As you can probably tell, they've been a big part of my life for many years, and is a genre I'm passionate about, but I often feel disappointed with. Thanks for watching. Oh, the game, by the way, that I'm playing in this video is Anarchy Online. The combat is a bit slow and cumbersome at the beginning, but does pick up as you invest more skills and level up. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great day.